Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Katie, for making this space possible with your work and your presence. Those local Washingtonians tuning in may be familiar with poet Stanley Plumley's Capote Prize-winning work of literary criticism, The Immortal Evening, in which Plumley describes a dinner that brought together John Keats, Charles Lamb, and William Wordsworth on December 28, 1817. Plumley's entire book is dedicated to the conversation that followed. I bring this up because it's the feeling I have when I read Farris's poetry, the feeling of being in the presence of many voices come together from different times and places and traditions and planes. Maybe a dinner in which Ovid, Keats, Dickinson, Italo Calvino, and Katie Farris are gathered in conversation. In a recent essay written with Ilya Kaminsky on waiting for news from Ukraine, waiting on news from scans, Farris describes the way the mind is really many minds, higher and lower minds, already enlightened and child fear minds, only not relaxed at dinner in conversation, but locked in a contest for the real. And here's what she writes. Imagine a man, let's call him Jacob, wrestling an angel all day, every day. My fear against my rational mind. They crash around the room while I'm trying to work or sleep, distracting me. Finally, one gets the other into a chokehold and they quiet down, just barely grunting, their faces red and their muscles trembling, sweat falling into each other's faces, and then I can slip into an uneasy rest for a couple of hours at a time. The poems from Farris's latest book, A Net to Catch My Body in Its Weaving, record the intimacies of this house of the heart, with its room of wrestling matches and its angels gathered around a table. It's a book of love poetry that reckons also with the diagnosis and treatment of cancer, the wake of mastectomy, and of life going on also amid all the scarring of our inner and outer bodies, personal and political. And yet in the midst of all that, it's so playful. The joy of language here is the triumphant quality of the poems. They're the best kinds of poems to me, like Akhmatova's poems. I would imagine very hard to translate. Poems whose lines become palindromes. And there is, as there's always been in Farris's poetry since her early work, this sense of walking through myth and fable. Poetry, by her own record, is an act of training ourselves how to be with such a world. In the poem, What Would Root, there's this beautiful image evocative of Daphne turning into a laurel tree, but also the Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree. It's through poetry that we learn how to make of our body our own Bodhi, our own body tree. Katie's the author of Standing in the Forests of Being Alive, which is coming out from Alice James in 2023. A Net to Catch My Body in Its Weaving, put out by Beloit in 2021. The hybrid form text, Boysgirls, which is just brilliant, from Tupelo has just republished that in 2019, and other books, 13 Intimacies and Mother Superior in Hell. Her work has appeared in literary journals, including Poetry, The Nation, The Believer, Massachusetts Review, and on and on. And she's the co-translator of several books of poetry, including Gossip and Metaphysics, Russian Modernist Poems and Prose. She's an associate professor of literature, media, and communication at Georgia Institute of Technology. So welcome, Katie Farris.
Thank you so much, David. What a really generous introduction. And I totally stepped on my cue. I was supposed to unveil myself at the end of the intro, but I was like, oh, did he do a very brief intro? How like
I didn't even notice.
Exciting and different. I just went for it. Anyway, it is so nice to see so many of your faces. It's such a great, I don't know, I miss in-person readings, but there's something really wonderful at the same time about being able to see so many people like at a glance. So I really appreciate you all. I appreciate your faces. David, Calvin, who has been chasing me down, trying to get me to sign various and sundry things, and I'm unfortunately terrible at that. I thank him. And Stephanie, thank you so much for your words. Welcome to the new incoming MFA class. That is so exciting. What an exciting opportunity you guys have, and what a wonderful community you're about to join. And those of you, I'm guessing there are a few who are just in your very last moments of your program. Thank you for being here with me. Thank you for taking the time to be here with me tonight. So I think how we're going to do this is that I'm going to read a small, like maybe 7 or 8 poems, and then we're going to stop and have a break and do a little bit of a Q&A, and then we're going to do that basically until we're done. I'll make sure to read the 4 poems that I sent y'all in advance. I think probably we can get through the whole chap. I mean, that's the delight of a chapbook, is it usually takes about 25-30 minutes to read. So it'll depend a little on Q&A, but we'll just sort of take it as it comes. But I'd really love to hear from you guys, to hear if you've got any questions. So I want to make this as interactive as possible, so we can feel like we're all together, as indeed we are. So I'm going to start with the first poem in the book, Why Write Love Poetry in a Burning World. Why write love poetry in a burning world? To train myself to find, in the midst of hell, what isn't hell. The body, bald, cancerous, but still beautiful enough to imagine living the body, washing the body, replacing a loose front porch step, the body chewing what it takes to keep a body going. This scene has a tune, a language I can read. This scene has a door I cannot close. I stand within its wedge. I stand within its shield. Why write love poetry in a burning world? To train myself in the midst of a burning world, to offer poems of love to a burning world. So in, let's see, August 2020, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. It was 6 days before my 37th birthday. And so this book follows more or less chronologically through a lot of those experiences. I found out that the chapbook had been accepted literally as I was coming out of anesthesia after my mastectomy. I'd written some of the poems in advance, and it kept kind of growing and changing through the course of it. So it doesn't follow quite all the way through the end of treatment, because it came out, I think it actually came out almost a year ago today. We're getting close to it, which it almost came out on exactly the final day of my radiation. So this book has a weird arc where it was really being written as I was experiencing all of these things, like almost in real time. It was a real blessing. It kept me distracted. So tell it slant. You float in the MRI gloam, several spiculated masses. I name you cactus, carcinoma bedamned. You make a desert of all of me. Have I said it slant enough? Here's a shot between the eyes. 6 days before my 37th birthday, a stranger called and said, "You have cancer, unfortunately," and then hung up the phone. Unfortunately, that part was true. It was a very dramatic revelation. This is called On the Morning of the Port Surgery. So when you get chemo, well, certain kinds of chemo, they implant a little pump basically into your body, and it makes the chemo drugs go directly into your heart, because they are not great for your veins, as you might imagine. So it's basically the first step for many people in their cancer journey. Before dawn, I walk outside the clock. I strip and fold my clothes into a bag, surrender my braid. I'm wheeled into the operating theater for the opening act of what will become a defining role as cancer patient, stage 3. Oh, feather-headed mongrel, my pickled flea-bit heart, thrice sword stabbed, please keep beating. Ungraceful, The heart boinks, suspended, spider-webbed, and drugged. In the event of my death. Moonwalked back in time with me to August 2020. Sorry, it wasn't the best of times, if you'll remember. COVID was at that point was a really scary spike. Looks like nothing now, just a blip on the radar. Nobody was leaving our houses, of course. I'm still not. But I cut my husband's hair for the first time, and I got to say, it was good. And then I tried to recreate it, and it was never that good again. But the first time, I don't know, beginner's luck, man. In the event of my death, what used to be a rope descending my vertebrae to the basement of my spine grew thin. In solidarity with my first chemotherapy, our cat leaves her whiskers on the hardwood floor. I gather them, each pure white parenthesis, and plant them in the throat of the earth. In quarantine, I learned to trim your barbarian hair. Now it stands always on end, a salute to my superior Barbary skills. In the event of my death, promise me you will find my heavy braid and bury it. I will need a rope to let me down into the earth. I've hidden others strategically across the globe, a net to catch my body in its weaving. This is the man you are, the boy you are. The man you are opens the door to your anguish, a mirror of my own. We've both grown silver around the eyes. But the boy you are brings me a melted candy bar in your pocket. You issue commands like an old man, then take out my trash like a young boy with a crush. Marriage and exercise. Marriage is an exercise in watching another lose. One grows attuned. Soon you can distinguish between the instance of severance, how pain enters their face like a hand hunting inside a puppet, and the moment they understand, they're now empty as a sock. A row of rows. Oh, this is funny. I was actually referencing this argument before we started the reading. We argue on the front porch. Whose turn is it to lecture the other? Fruit salad or steak? And was Whitman or Dickinson the greater epic poet? We argue Whitman about the ripeness of the bananas, the rawness of the meat, and whether it's okay to throw apple cores in the street. I hold it is not. A pleasant row of rows, little tugs on the string of our love, just enough to pull our days taut. Outside Atlanta Cancer Care, I returned to this point of wonder. What kind of animal began to stand on such small feet and only two? What vertical absurdity, what upright madness. Perhaps we were imitating trees, lifting our arms, wishing for roots, and then forgot to set ourselves down on our four more rational feet. Our longing grew our fingers longer, twigs to our branches, for if you long hard enough, do you not find fruit in your palms? I return to this point of wonder. Okay, yeah, there are a couple of slightly blue poems in here, so, cover your ears if you need to. An unexpected turn of events midway through chemotherapy. I'd like some sex, please. I'm not too picky. After all, have you seen me so skinny you could shiv me with me? Philisexical, soft and gentle, a real straight fucking, rhymed or metrical. Whatever you've got, I'll take it, just so long as we're naked. This poem is called Rachel's Chair. It's a funny thing when you write a book and a poem that you put in. I put in this poem because it felt like I needed a poem between the last poem and the next poem, and I had it and it was laying around, and it's fine. But it's like one that a lot of people really love. It's probably one of the more frequently mentioned poems in reviews, and I'm like, really, guys? That one? Okay. I mean, it's not my book anymore. It's your book, so you know. Rachel's Chair. Once, many years ago, we made love at a friend's house. We were overnight guests, not perverts on the whole. But what I am trying to say is she owned a chair so perfect for lovemaking, we joked about asking to take it home. If I had only known then how rarely we would find such objects, I would have. I think I'm going to read this next poem and then I'm going to stop for a moment, and then because it's right before the next poem that I gave y'all to read, so we can just stop and have a little chat after this. Oh, well, it ends, well, that's fine. If marriage. If marriage is a series of increasing intimacies, a slow, sweet collapse into oneness, I would still beg your forgiveness for asking your assistance, unwinding that pale hair from my hemorrhoid. That's one place to end, I suppose, for a Q&A break.
The hemorrhoid is a great place to end.
You know, we're leaving it behind us. I don't know.
You know, on that note, the poems are hilarious. Your ability to tap into humor, and even in your reading of them, which is spectacular, by the way. I mean, your students must just be, you know, so adoring of you. You bring so much, even to the Zoom world. I mean, the room is lighting up. But I can't do this. When I try to be funny in a poem, I told my students this last week, when I try to be funny in a poem, people come up to me afterwards and they say, that's the saddest thing I've ever heard. I just can't be funny. How do you do it? Maybe you can't help it. Maybe it just comes out that way and there's no getting around it. But where does it come from when you're writing? Are you entertaining yourself?
That's such a good question. And I'm reminded for some reason of like the fact that I can't remember where I heard this or what the context was, but like clowns are always actually at home depressed. You know, the best kind of humor comes from kind of oftentimes the darkest people. Typically, I'd say in my previous work up to this point, what humor there was more in terms of language play. Like I would say terrible things like horny, corny feet, you know, stuff like that, where it was more about language jokes. And I love, language jokes I've always really loved. I think this book is the first time I ever tried to write something about myself. I'm a fabulist in my heart is the way I feel, you know, I'm more of a surrealist. I'm not much of a realist. So, this was a strange project for me to be kind of moving into a space where it's almost like the opposite of, I think, a lot of poetry journeys. Like a lot of people kind of start off with their own feelings and emotions and experiences, and then they start sort of angling into other parts of the world. And I'd always been kind of cutting the other. Well, I guess, as always, there's a wide variety of different ways to approach. But for me, I was trying to figure out how to make it happen. And I think I couldn't take myself very seriously as a poet writing about myself. It just felt hard. So I think that's where some of the humor originally came from. Like there was a lot of me kind of poking fun at my own attempts to write, serious poetry or real poetry. It's also my first time writing lineated poetry. Like this was such a strange world for me. So I think the humor helped me feel more safe in a way. Like I was like, I'm not taking this seriously. And then, as I started writing these poems, some of the love poems right before I was diagnosed. And then as I was moving into the cancer treatments, life got significantly more serious. And I think that gave me a little bit of permission to bring a little bit more gravity in. So I don't really know, but that's my, that's the best answer I can come up with.
Well, I hear the language play in all the poems still. I mean, there's some, the palindrome poem, which you might get to later, is just full of it, and it's just a delicious poem in that sense. And there's a lightness to that as well, but it's a beautiful balance of the subject matter, which is heavy, and something else which is a musical lightness that's playing in the background. We have some questions here from the group. Rachel Louise Snyder, our colleague, who was one of the two people who mentioned you just randomly, separate times in February, I guess. And I thought, I've got to get Katie here to give a reading. This is the universe speaking to me. So Rachel was one of those folks who mentioned you. Was writing this a different experience for you as a writer, since you say this is the first time you've written about yourself? I'm thinking about how it can feel different when one writes an essay versus, say, fiction. What was the tactile experience for you?
Oh, that's a great tactile. I like that. Yeah, and it was a tactile experience because I'm writing by hand for the first time. When I was writing hybrid forms and when I was writing stuff that I was trying really hard to write fiction, it was terrible. I'm not a fiction writer. The experience was always on the keyboard, and I am a fast talker, and I want to get things down very quickly. And the writing things by hand forced me really to go much slower than I was comfortable with. And that was a really new experience for me. And the other thing is, many of the poems in this book, and like the stuff I was writing early on, actually, I'm going to flip through and see if much of this ended up. Some of it did. So I was writing a lot of poems in dimeter. So 2 beats per line, not necessarily any particular foot. So that it was like, I was like, I don't know how to write poems in lines. I've always written in sentences before. So I found metrical work to be like kind of a nice way to arbitrarily cut my lines until I learned how to break my own lines where they were supposed to, where I was supposed to feel them. Because it took me a long time to develop that sense after so many years of sentence writing, so actually it was a very tactile experience. I love that, that take on the question. It really, thank you. It gave me a great entryway to answer it.
Can I just fangirl because I'm sorry, David. I had to unmute and tell her how much I love her. I just talked about this book. I'm a nonfiction writer and a journalist. But I got it from Beloit like months and months ago. I've read sections of it out loud. I mean, I'm so excited to see you, hear you, listen to your poems. Okay, I'm going to mute myself now.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you.
I should do a shout out for Hope Nyer, who's my student in one of my undergraduate classes, and she was the other person who mentioned you. Hope, are you out there?
I am. Thanks so much for coming in.
Oh, thank you, Hope. That's so lovely.
Well, let's do more questions on the other end of it. Do you want to read a few more poems?
Sure. Yeah, let's read a few more.
More questions with the time we have remaining.
So I will go ahead and I'm going to start with Emeloma, a riddle and an answer, which was one of the ones that I think was sent out to all of y'all. And I'll just keep, going for a little while. Emeloma, a riddle and an answer. So Emeloma is this weird mashup of Emily Dickinson, who was sort of the guiding light in a lot of ways through this book. I had been on this long project of reading her complete works. It had taken me many, many months, and I finished it, like literally I was holding the book when I went into my first oncology appointment. Like I was finishing the last couple poems almost as I was, it didn't quite line up exactly, but like it was a very close moment. So I had all these poems about Emily Dickinson. She felt like she was kind of a guiding force for me. And then the ending of the word oma is a mass or not always a tumor, but like a physical mass in the body. So Emeloma was like the first title of this chapbook. I'm glad it didn't end up being the last title of this chapbook, but that's where it comes from. Emeloma, a riddle and an answer. Will you be my death breast? I had asked you in jest, and in response you hardened, a test of my resolve, malignant, magnificent, palimpsest. Will you be my death, Emily? Today, I placed your collected poems over my breast, my heart knocking fast on your front cover. Will you be my death, chemo? The shell of myself in the sphere of time, plucking the wool of my hair from its branches. Will you be my death, Emily, and keep the sky from reaching inside? You, the voice, me, the faithful echo. Will you be my death, echo? Do you know? No. In which meadow mow? The ginkgo grows, goes. Witches follow, which furrowed foes. What is winnowed? What is woe? This actually, most of this is in Demeter. And this was another sequence that I actually began before I found out I had cancer. I was writing these, will you be my death, X? And there were like hundreds of them. I don't know why I got on this wild hair, but I just kept writing them and writing them and writing them. And one of them was originally, will you be my death breast? I also did my heart and a bunch of other things, but I was like, damn, y'all, like, this isn't supposed to be spoken into being. Like, that's crazy. This is a very long title. Finishing Emily Dickinson, first deacon in William Blake's Church of the Marriage of Heaven and Hell in the oncologist's waiting room. Oh, Emily, goodbye. We met in February and parted in July. I meet your sweet velocity in everything that flies, in mote and star, in sphere, in bird and phosphorus of God. Oblique, you preached obliquity. Your body, steeple for the church of mystery, your bell rings on beyond. And this is called A Week Before Surgery, I Practiced My Body. There's a line in here that I basically wholesale stole from Tomas Chalamun, who's a wonderful poet. And I'm not sure if this is true, but he said that Giotto used his studies of sheep to sketch his angels. And I think that has cracked me up. It's like sheep-faced angels. I don't know. But he's a very wacky poet. I highly recommend him if you haven't read him, but I wouldn't take his word for it. A week before surgery, I practiced my body. Oh, and there's another thing. Jonah is it's a Christian story about a, boy, that's a long story, but basically it's a guy who was swallowed by a whale and then regurgitated. We'll just stick with that. And ambergris is whale vomit. If you find it on the beach, it smells, and I do not joke, amazing. It's the most extraordinarily beautiful smelling thing. If you find it, pick it up and we'll split the proceeds. It's worth an enormous amount of money. It doesn't hurt them to get rid of it. That's what ambergris is. Okay, it's a short poem with a long gloss. A week before surgery, I practiced my body. Like Giotto's angels, sketched from his studies of sheep, I open the jaws of my back to the sky, eating my body deeper into this blue. Like Jonah, vomited from the whale, fragrant as ambergris, or plain as any woman who, a week before mastectomy, practices being opened. I wake to find you wandering the museum of my body. 24 Greek urns painted with wrestling boys comprise my spine. My ribs, the bows of 14 Viking archers pinched from their graves, their fingers forever drawing. Unusually well preserved, my feet are the elaborate slippers of a beloved Chinese concubine, heavily embroidered with vein and shadow. My bald head, a lofty sunlit dome lined with pietà after pietà, every mourning virgin great in grief and execution. My organs are the furniture galleries everyone skips, but for you, carpenter, standing gilt-fingered before my heart's armoire, stroking always toward the grain. Okay, I'll do one more and then we'll take another little break here. This is called After the Mastectomy, and this is actually what somebody said to me once. At the oncologist's office, a man stares. I stare back until he says, "People must stare at you." Why bother closing a door when everyone demands it open? I go into the world with my tongue out and my shirt unbuttoned, my keys in the lock, a 6-inch scar instead of a nipple. How can a watchtower hide? I am well positioned to seek out fires and invading hordes. My bald head, the beacon, which spreads the first alarm. A thing that you can't tell in this situation is that I am also 6 foot tall. So, and normally I have red hair. At that point I didn't, but yes, I painfully stick out even when I am not bald. Okay, so we'll stop there. And again, if you have any questions, I'm happy to.
Yeah, we've been having some comments in the chat. You know, there's a great line from Thomas Solomon, something like, "I was born in a meadow snapping my fingers." It's one of those lines that just haunted me forever. I love him too. Okay, let me see. This student says, I would love to know from you, who is your hero? Who has inspired you? Who do you look up to, and why?
That is such a great
question to start the next
yeah,
phase.
Right. Boy, there are a lot of answers to that. One of the things I'm back into my cancer mindset, which I honestly have a hard time leaving even still. And one of my heroes through the course of this journey, actually two, my mother had breast cancer when she was 40. So she was about 4 years older than I was. And my sibling, who is non-binary and uses they, them pronouns, my sibling Eli was diagnosed with breast cancer when they were 34. And they had a recurrence when they were 36. Actually, Eli is not my blood sibling, but has been my step sibling since I was a baby, literally. So we've known each other our whole lives. So one of the things that happens, I think, I was my mom's primary caregiver through her breast cancer, and I was in high school at the time. Standing on the outside of that, I learned a lot from her, but it was also very difficult for me. I was away at school for high school, and I came home to care for her. I didn't have my driver's license, but suddenly I had to drive her to doctor's appointments. You know, she was very ill, and I couldn't really understand it. You know, I couldn't wrap my brain around it at that point, being such a young person. And when my sibling was going through cancer, I was not able to be there with them for a lot of different reasons. So when you enter into this unfortunate, I want to say sorority, but that's not accurate because people of all genders can get breast cancer. But when you enter into this nation of breast cancer or cancer in general, okay, right? Like imagine it as a country. Some people live there for the rest of their lives. Some people just kind of pass through. But you just understand things in a very different way, and you get a whole different perspective on what people are going through as they go through that cancer. And I think about my mom as a single parent who had no money, who lost her job and lost her home while she was going through her cancer journey, and how much I was struggling to be there for her in the course of my own 16-year-old brain. And I think, my God, what a hell of a woman, what a hell of a hero. And that she was able, obviously, to guide me through some of the really boring, like silly stuff. I was like, hey, Mom, what's your armpit look like now? Like after radiation, you lose hair. It's like getting a laser hair removal. I was like, did your hair ever grow back? Like the really silly little things, but then also the really profound stuff and the very hard stuff. My mom came out, my mastectomy was on January 11th, which I think was the most COVID deaths of any day still yet. And it was really scary to be with her in the space in our house. We were all wearing masks. I was terrified, and she was really struggling with her own feelings as I was going through this treatment. Of course she is, anyway, that ended up being way more personal and longer than I meant to be. But like in terms of personally speaking, and in the context of my cancer journey, certainly my doctors and so on, but like to be welcomed by close family members, I was really lucky. Not everybody gets that kind of support or understanding from others. So that's one answer. That's what I have now.
Wow. Thanks for that generous answer. We have another question, but this one is more about craft. What physical spaces do you seek out when you write poetry? Do you ever write out in nature? And what environmental conditions, Katie, have you found help your creativity flourish?
That is a great question. I have a wonderful room in my house, which is not my office, but I have sort of slowly taken it over and turned it into my office, where you can look out. I live in Atlanta, and I'm about 2 blocks away from a stream, and there are tons of trees growing up on the banks of the stream. So between the trees in my backyard, I can pretty much just look out on trees out as far as the I can see, which for me is heaven. There are a lot of trees in my poems, you might have noticed. So trees are big for me. I have a hard time writing outside. I get very like everything, I want to look at everything. And so I'm just like, yeah, I'm too distractible to write outside. But this is it's a feeling of being outside without actually all of those distractions. I have to write, unfortunately, in pretty much complete silence. I don't know how I developed this. I have 3 brothers, and 2 other siblings. It was not a quiet house growing up for the most part, but I needed to be pretty quiet. It helps to have a cat in my lap, that's nice. I tend to write in the morning, but I don't hold on to that too hard. One of my early teachers told me, he was like, if you can avoid developing a routine around your writing, that might be good. He's like, honestly, I have worked really hard not to do that, so I can kind of write wherever and whenever. I liked that idea, and I tried very hard for many years to do it, and I found I can't. I really need to have environmental cues. I really need to have a space set up. I really need to be kind of in the zone. So I have forgiven myself eventually. But I'm also not one of those people who's like, I get up at 4:30 and I drink 1 cup of weak tea and then I write for 8 hours. And then, that's not me either. So I write for between 20 minutes and an hour a day. And if I do that fairly consistently, say 5 days a week, you can get a lot done in that space. And part of, again, one of the things I had to get over as I was becoming a grown-up writer is feeling like I wasn't doing it enough, and feeling like I really needed to be working for, at least 4 hours a day in order to be serious about this. But, I've been doing it for 20 years. It accrues, you know what I mean? Over time, it does accrue. Everybody's got their own, the way they need to do it. Like, I think the important thing is whatever gets your butt in the seat, if telling yourself I'm only going to write for 5 minutes, that's it, do it. It's better than not doing it at all.
Yeah, on that note, you began really as an experimental writer. You even said earlier that you consider yourself a fabulist and a surrealist, and I do too. And was it a surprise for you that these poems, you said that these poems, which were more about yourself and your own story, started coming out? Was there a moment when you started to coax them out, or did they just start to appear and ask things of you?
I think that when the first poems I started writing about the real world were sort of joke poems that I was writing for my husband. And actually a lot of them ended up in this manuscript, like the hemorrhoid poem, right? Like it was a joke. And I would read them to him to make him laugh, or like if he would say or do something ridiculous, which happens all the time, I would just be looking at him and he would slowly turn around and be like, don't write a poem about that. And I'd be like, I am writing a poem about that, And I'm lucky in that I am married also to a poet who is very like understanding of me putting like basically anything in a poem as long as it works. He's much more offended if the poem is bad than if it presents him in an embarrassing light. So those poems came spontaneously more as like gifts or like love notes. And then, as I said, once I got diagnosed, I found myself needing very much to write and not knowing how. And initially what I ended up doing was there's one poem that we'll get to sort of toward the end, which is, it's sort of a crazy poem about, I think in this draft, it talks about Lupron or Zoladex. You'll hear it probably in the course of the poem. It was a poem that I'd pretty much written long ago. It had nothing to do with having cancer, but it did have to do with getting an injection. And it was an injection in the gut, which is actually where I get my monthly injections to prevent basically further cancer from developing. And so I changed it very slightly, and I changed the title, and I was like, okay, that's a cancer poem. And what I did take a couple more old poems, and most of them didn't work, but that's how I started. I was like, okay, I'm going to take these old pieces and try to wrench them around and make them into something different. And then I started sort of like editing into those poems and writing into them more, being like, oh, this needs a whole stanza, so I'm going to write a whole stanza. And then slowly it was like almost, sometimes I would, it was like a virus. I would like invade the host, and then I would like remove all of the old, stanzas as I was writing new poems. And then suddenly it was just a brand new piece. So it did take a while for me to coax them out, but then suddenly it was like the switch flipped. And actually the next poem I'm going to read, which maybe this is a good transition. This was one of the hardest poems I had to write because I didn't know how to write it yet. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that when I get to the end of the poem. This is called Woman with Amputated Breast Awaits PET Scan Results. The waiting, sleek as otters, slips between your lips. Without the waiting, who can know when spring will come or snow? Heading south, the geese all beat the waiting with their wings. Turn on the light at 2 a.m. The waiting stands, hand on your head, a most maternal haunting. Swimming, the human body humps along. Each dive in time ends so close to its beginning. Help me to spell waiting. I forget. And whom can I tell how much I want to live? I want to live. A stone, the waiting weights my body into stone. What's left? Almost a palindrome. So PET scan results can take, up to 2 weeks, sometimes longer to get back. And typically with cancer, what you're finding out is if the cancer has spread beyond its local place. And once that happens, it's a stage 4 cancer, which is incurable and will likely be, what ends up killing you. So this was my first round of PET scan results right after the mastectomy. And I was actively waiting while I was writing this poem. And I remember the first line came where I was watching some geese lift up off of the water. But I was writing all these images of waiting and using waiting in different ways grammatically. And I felt like I was like, yes, I have kind of most of a poem, but there's something that is so important that is missing. And I cannot figure out what it is. It felt so high. It felt so artificial in the way that poetry, in a good way, often feels artificial. It is art, right? It is artsy, but there was nothing that grounded it. And it was just saying, I want to live. That's what I needed to say in the poem to pull it down into the realm of not just poetry out here, but like something at that moment I was feeling quite desperate, and it felt very true and very scary. It was a moment of vulnerability. And again, with my learning how to write these kinds of poems, I just wasn't used to having to do that. You don't have to do that in fabulism for the most part, So this poem taught me a lot. Okay, so I've got 9 more minutes. I'm going to skip a little bit around here, but I'll read everything that we read, that you guys read in your packet. I want to read that poem. I told you I basically just changed the title in the very end of this poem. And it's called Woman with Amputated Breast Returns for Her Injection. Now I lack the muscle to pull me into the third dimension, but in these two, I can give you the world. 3 drains, 5 scans, $20,000. Come, doctor, how do you like me now? I never wanted to be anything but biddable. You see the outline of my shape? Fill it in with your pencils, 7 points tickling me with color. I can. Watch me can, watch me do, watch me has, watch me watch. This cancer patient has ambition. I scratch, and here we are dancing the chart. When you give me that Zoladex shot, it's from one long needle and right in the gut. So you can see any moment that there were the 3 drains, 5 scans, $20,000 I changed. Come doctor, how do you like me now? This cancer patient has ambition, dancing the chart, and then the loop run shot. It was like I changed like 6 things to make it into a poem that could fit into this sort of cancer land. But the rest of it was more about, you know, it was sort of a feminist feel of being viewed, which unfortunately translates really well into the medical gaze, from the male gaze into the medical gaze. Okay, I'm going to read 2 more poems. Yeah, okay. When you walk over the earth. When you walk over the earth, it asserts itself. Here, 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 it says to your feet. You must reckon with the earth, though it enters you less, unless. The sky always has its hand in you, as if you were a puppet, through your ears, down your throat, into your lungs, and with the tips of its fingers there, it caresses every capillary, each blood cell, until they blush. And then the final poem in the book here is What Would Root? Walking through a cathedral of oak trees and bristlecone pines, scolded by squirrels in their priestly black, their white collars wagging with the force of their scolding, I was struck simultaneously in both eyes by some sort of flying detritus, pollen or seeds, and stopped to lean against a rock and rub it, I thought, away. It was May, it was May, it was May, and the air was sweet with pine and island mountain lilac. The squirrels, I mentioned them already, etc., and the lizards ran down the spines of rocks like a bad feeling. I could see everything. Red-headed hummingbirds dipped their beaks into the little red hoods of penstemon, and I, a redhead, could hear everything. A red-crested woodpecker who was not offended. I did not know his name. Everything smelled green. It was all green, really. Even the red was anti-green. And though my eyes ached from everything seeing, I could taste the granite in the spring. Oh yes, I drank water from the ground. I was wild even then, though the squirrels scolded me and tried to convince me I was not. Soon I crested a rise. The land spread itself greenly for me, and I wished I had seed to toss into that green just to see what would root. My right eye would not close to this view. Why would it? But when I reached up to touch it, I felt a twig emerging and another from my other eye. That they were a part of my body, I could not doubt. They were living and enervated and jutting out. I sat down, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck, understanding for the first time they were not hairs, but roots. Everything. It was all green. The twigs in my eyes tasted sunlight with my mouth. The roots drew the salt from my sweat into their vacuum, and I was no longer hungry. Everything was everything. The roots in my skull shifted and I lay down beneath my own branches. I had to wiggle a bit to find a place to lay my head. The rock was very hard and I needed softer ground. Yes, a place for the top of my head to come off, to nuzzle into the earth, to drink. So you might be familiar with Emily Dickinson's line about she knows something is poetry when the top of her head comes off. I'm paraphrasing terribly. But yeah, so that's the final poem of the book. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Marianne.
Katie, yes, Marianne and I are huge fans of this poem. When I was 20, I took a poetry class at Penn State and went to my first poetry reading in a little cafe somewhere, and people got up and read their work, and I became a poetry servant for life. And I have to say that tonight I have that same feeling. Just listening to you read, listening to you talk about the work, even in this mode, it's just completely electrifying, and it reminds me why I do this and why I return to it over and over again. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you all so much. It's been such an amazing pleasure. I am happy to do one more question. I know we're sort of at the end of time.
Please. Joe is asking a question. I'd love to know a bit about how the concept of sick time influences your work, whether the work itself or your approach to writing.
That is a great question. And I'm going to go off of my vague memory of what sick time means, but if it means something else, feel free to interrupt and be like, that is not what I meant. It's a thing that I think it's weird to have had cancer in the midst of the pandemic, when in a sense, everybody was on a sort of sick time at that point, meaning, usually when you're on sick time, you've got this, the outside world is proceeding in the way I guess it always proceeds, but suddenly you are in an entirely different time zone, right? Everything works at a different pace. That's partly because when you are disabled, you physically cannot operate at the same level or yeah, I'm just going to say that that's improperly said, but that's what I mean, more or less. And also because it's like suddenly becoming very aware of deep time. Like, have you ever heard this idea that like all of like history of life on Earth, 4 billion years, if you picture it as your arm, human beings have been around as long as the end of your fingernail. That's it. Deep time has this way of putting things in immediate perspective, right? It's sort of when you're in a position, especially I think when you've got an illness that is potentially life-threatening, suddenly you're thinking about mortality and you're thinking about your own time in a very different way, because you're thinking, am I going to be here for weeks, months? I've got actually written out in my journal, I've got plans for if I'm only going to be alive for this long. Here's my plan. If I've got months, here's my plan. If I've got 1 year, here's my plan. 5 years, 10 years, and so in that sense too, time is really strange. And one of the ways it ended up affecting my writing specifically was I said, if I have minutes to go, I'm going to be going out writing. If there is one thing that I'm going to do with my time that I have left, I am going to write. And in a sense, like writing and spending time with the people I love, that's it. If I had to winnow everything else out, that is what it was. So in terms of like, one of the things I think about in relation to sick time is the concept of spoonies and having a limited number of spoons. If you don't know that, you should look it up, look up spoonies. It's really wonderful way of imagining life for people who have disabilities. And I was measuring out my spoons very carefully. And unfortunately, I'm a year out of the first phase of my treatment, but I still, I just am not bouncing back. So I still have this very much this sort of spoony attitude of like, okay, I have 4 hours a day. How much of that time is going to be spent doing all the everyday things, and how much of it is going to be spent doing the things that are important. And that's something that I feel like hopefully is something that like so many things, so many wonderful things that the disability community has and has the ability to share with people who maybe are not familiar with it, to say, you've got to prioritize, guys. maybe you don't have to prioritize the same way we do, but on a day-to-day basis, sometimes you got to think about your spoons, it's worth thinking about. So I hope that answers your question more or less, Joe. And I hope that I'm right about sort of grasping that I was doing a lot of reading for a period of time, and then I've got chemo brain still. It's fuzzy. Everything's fuzzy.
Well, Katie Farris, you are an honorary member of our MFA community forever.
Oh, thank you. Thank
And
you.
we are totally in love with you, and we are just so blessed to have had this time with you, and that you offered it to us at the last minute to come and to share your work. It's just brilliant. Brilliant.
My great pleasure. You guys have been so wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel revived. Take care, guys.
Night,
Bye-bye.
everyone.